In the vast expanse of Montana's rugged terrain, where the mountains kissed the sky and wild horses roamed free, a story of unexpected love unfolded that would change two lives forever. When Eleanor Thompson stepped off the train at Willow Creek Station, clutching nothing but a worn leather suitcase and the faded newspaper advertisement that had brought her there, she never imagined being abandoned before she even met her intended husband. They said she was too scared, too plain, not what was promised. But fate had other plans when Mason Walker, a blind rancher with wounds deeper than his sightless eyes, extended his hand in the darkness. He couldn't see her trembling lips or downcast eyes, but he felt something in her that others had missed, an inner strength and beauty that would ultimately heal them both. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Montana Territory, 1885. The train whistle pierced the spring air as it approached Willow Creek Station, its black smoke billowing against the backdrop of snow-capped mountains. Eleanor Thompson pressed her face against the smudged window, heart pounding in her chest. After 3 days of travel from Boston, she had finally arrived at her destination and her future. At 26, Eleanor had resigned herself to spinsterhood back east. With no family left after the fever took her parents and younger brother 2 years prior, and their modest savings dwindling as she struggled to maintain their small bookbinding shop, the newspaper advertisement had seemed like divine intervention. Seeking a bride of good character and gentle disposition, aged 20-30, must be willing to relocate to Montana Territory, will provide a comfortable home on an established cattle ranch. Reply with description and photograph. The advertisement had been placed by a man named Thomas Reynolds, a cattle rancher who, according to his letters, had built a prosperous life but lacked a partner to share it with. Their correspondence over 6 months had been cordial, if somewhat formal. He described his large ranch house, the thriving herd, and the small but growing town nearby. She had sent him her daguerreotype, the one her mother had insisted on having made on her 25th birthday, along with honest accounts of her skills as a bookbinder, her love of literature, and her willingness to learn ranch work. When his proposal came by mail, along with train fare and a promise of a new beginning, Eleanor had sold the shop, packed her few belongings, and left behind the only life she had ever known. Now, as the train lurched to a stop, doubt crushed her chest. Like a vice. What if he didn't like her? What if she couldn't adapt to this wild country? The passengers around her gathered their belongings, eager to disembark, while Eleanor remained frozen in her seat. "Ma'am, this is your stop, ain't it?" The conductor's voice pulled her from her thoughts. Eleanor nodded, rising on shaky legs. "Yes, thank you." The platform at Willow Creek Station was little more than wooden planks raised a few feet off the ground, with a small building serving as ticket office and telegraph station. As Eleanor descended the train steps, her eyes scanned the small crowd for a face that might match the description Thomas had provided: tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick mustache. A harried-looking man in a wrinkled suit approached her, clutching a folded piece of paper. "Miss Thompson?" Eleanor clutched her suitcase tighter. "Yes, that's me. Name's Walter Green. I work for the Reynolds family." He didn't offer his hand. "I've been sent to meet you." Relief flooded through her. "Oh, how wonderful. Is Mr. Reynolds unable to come himself?" The man's expression soured. "Mr. Reynolds sent me a message." He thrust the paper toward her. He's decided the arrangement won't work out after all." Eleanor's fingers trembled as she unfolded the note. The handwriting was hurried, almost careless. "Miss Thompson, upon consideration, I find our arrangement unsuitable. The photograph you provided did not properly convey your true appearance. I require a wife of confident disposition who can manage a household and social obligations without hesitation. Your timid demeanor, as reported by my associates who observed your arrival, indicates you would not thrive in our community. The train fare enclosed will return you to Boston on tomorrow morning's eastbound train. Thomas Reynolds. The words blurred as tears threatened. Eleanor blinked them back furiously, unwilling to show weakness. He hasn't even met me, she whispered. Walter shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Reynolds has business associates who arrived on yesterday's train. They happened to see you at one of the stops. Said you looked scared as a rabbit, clutching that suitcase like it might fly away. He avoided her eyes. Mr. Reynolds needs a strong woman for his position in the community, entertaining and such. Eleanor stood taller, squaring her shoulders despite the humiliation burning through her. I see. There's a boarding house in town where you can stay until tomorrow's train. Walter handed her another folded bill. This should cover your expenses. Before Eleanor could respond, he tipped his hat awkwardly and hurried away, clearly relieved to be done with his unpleasant task. The other passengers had dispersed, leaving Eleanor alone on the platform as the train pulled away, its whistle mournful in the afternoon air. The station attendant cast curious glances her way as he swept the wooden planks, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Where would she go? She had sold everything in Boston. There was nothing to return to. You look like you could use a cup of coffee. The deep voice startled Eleanor from her thoughts. A man stood a few feet away, tall and broad-shouldered, but not matching Thomas Reynolds' description. He wore simple clothes, a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, dusty trousers, tucked into scuffed boots. His face was striking, strong jaw covered with a neatly trimmed beard, high cheekbones, and thick brown hair that brushed his collar. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a pale, cloudy blue that didn't quite focus on her. I'm sorry to intrude, he continued when she didn't respond, but I couldn't help overhearing. Sounds like you've had your plans upset. Eleanor clutched her suitcase tighter. I'm fine, thank you. The man smiled, the expression warming his face. No offense, ma'am, but you don't sound fine. My name's Mason Walker. I run the Double W Ranch about 5 miles outside town. Eleanor. Thompson, she replied automatically, years of proper Boston upbringing making her respond, despite her distress. Miss Thompson, I'd be happy to buy you that cup of coffee at Sarah's Cafe across the street. Best apple pie in the territory, too. He gestured vaguely toward the road. Unless you'd prefer to keep standing here while the whole town wonders why a Boston lady is stranded at the station. Eleanor glanced around, noting the curious looks from passers-by. With a defeated sigh, she nodded. Coffee would be nice, Mr. Walker. Wonderful. He smiled again, but didn't move toward her. Instead, he extended his hand slightly. Would you mind? The street crossing can be treacherous with the wagon traffic. That's when realization dawned on Eleanor. His unfocused gaze, the slight hesitation in his movements. Mason Walker was blind. Of course, she said, stepping forward to place her hand lightly on his offered arm. Mason's arm was solid beneath her fingers, and he moved with surprising confidence as they crossed the dusty street to a small building with a hand-painted sign, reading Sarah's Cafe. A bell jingled as they entered the warm space filled with the aroma of coffee and baked goods. Mason Walker. A plump woman with grey-streaked hair bustled toward them. Twice in 1 week? To what do we owe the pleasure? Afternoon. Sarah, this is Miss Eleanor Thompson. She could use some of your coffee and perhaps a slice of that famous pie. Sarah's keen eyes took in Eleanor's travel-worn appearance and the suitcase she still clutched. Of course. Take your usual table by the window, Mason. I'll bring everything. Right over. Mason navigated confidently through the small cafe to a corner table. Only his outstretched hand, lightly brushing the chairbacks as he passed, betrayed his condition. Once seated, Eleanor found herself at a loss for words. The enormity of her situation crashed over her. Stranded in an unfamiliar town, her plans and hopes dashed before she'd even had a chance. "Now," Mason said, once Sarah had brought their coffee and generous slices of apple pie, "would you like to tell me what brought you to Willow Creek, Miss Thompson?" Eleanor stared into her coffee cup. "I fear it's rather humiliating." "We're all strangers at some point," Mason replied, "and sometimes a stranger is the easiest person to talk to." Perhaps it was his kind tone, or the fact that his sightless eyes couldn't judge her appearance, as Thomas Reynolds's associates had. But Eleanor found herself recounting the whole story: her parents' death, the struggling business, the correspondence with Thomas Reynolds, and finally the crushing rejection upon her arrival. When she finished, silence fell between them. Mason's expression had darkened as she spoke, his jaw tightening at the mention of Reynolds. "Thomas Reynolds," he finally said, "is known for his particular tastes and social climbing. Rumor has it this is the third bride he sent for and rejected." Eleanor's eyes widened. "The third?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mason nodded grimly. The man's looking for a certain type, someone to enhance his standing with the banker's wife and the mayor's sister. "Sounds like he's decided you're too—" He hesitated. "Too scared," Eleanor supplied, bitterness edging her voice. "Too plain." "Well, I wouldn't know about planes," Mason said with a small smile, gesturing to his eyes. "Been blind since a riding accident 6 years ago, but as for being scared," he leaned forward slightly, "it takes considerable courage to leave everything familiar behind and travel across the country to marry a stranger. That doesn't strike me as the action of someone who's too frightened to manage." His words eased something tight in Eleanor's chest. "You're very kind, Mr. Walker." "Not particularly," he replied. "Just factual. Now, what are your plans?" Eleanor sighed. "Mr. Reynolds provided return fare for tomorrow's train, but there's nothing left for me in Boston. I sold everything to come. Here." Mason was quiet for a moment, his fingers tapping thoughtfully against his coffee cup. "I may have a proposition for you, Miss Thompson, if you're willing to hear it." Eleanor tensed. She'd had quite enough propositions for one day. Sensing her hesitation, Mason quickly added, "Nothing improper, I assure you. It's just that I find myself in need of help at my ranch. My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, is getting on in years and could use an assistant. The work would include cooking, cleaning, and helping with accounts. I understand from your story that you ran a business in Boston." "A small bookbinding shop," Eleanor confirmed. "I kept the ledgers and correspondence." "Excellent. I've been relying on Mrs. Abernathy to read my mail and ledgers, but her eyesight isn't what it used to be. The position would include room and board, plus a monthly wage." He named a sum that, while modest, was fair. Eleanor studied him, suspicion mingling with desperate hope. "Why would you offer this to a complete stranger?" Mason's smile held no offense. "Because Mrs. Abernathy has been threatening to retire to her daughter's home in Oregon for months, and because I'm a decent judge of character, even without my sight." "You have an honest voice, Miss Thompson. And frankly, anyone who can endure that train journey and then face rejection with the dignity you've shown has the kind of backbone we value out here. And what would people say about a single woman living at your ranch?" Mrs. Abernathy serves as chaperone, and her reputation is beyond reproach. Besides, the Double W employs 6 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse, and my foreman and his wife have the cabin nearest the main house. He shrugged. "People might talk initially, they always do, but they'll settle once they see you're there to work." Eleanor considered his offer. The prospect of returning to Boston with nothing was bleak, and the alternative, a position with room, board, and wages, offered at least a temporary solution until she could make more permanent. Plans. I would need to know more about the position, she said carefully. The specific duties, hours, living arrangements. Mason's expression brightened. Of course, reasonable questions. He proceeded to outline the role in detail, assisting Mrs. Abernathy with cooking for the ranch hands, keeping the ranch's accounts, reading correspondence and newspapers aloud, and general household management. The ranch house has a small bedroom off the kitchen that would be yours, he explained. It's modest, but comfortable. Sundays would be your day off, and you'd be welcome to come into town for church services, if you wish. As he spoke, Eleanor found herself warming to the idea. The work sounded manageable, perhaps even enjoyable compared to the uncertain role of being Thomas Reynolds' wife. "Could I have some time to consider your offer?" she asked when he'd finished. "Of course. I need to finish some business in town. Picking up supplies and such. I'll be heading back to the ranch in about 2 hours. If you decide you're interested, meet me at the general store at 4 o'clock. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a few bills. "This should cover your coffee and pie, plus a room at the boarding house for tonight if you decide against my offer. Mr. Walker, I couldn't possibly consider it an advance on your wages if you accept the position," he interrupted gently. "And if not, consider it a welcome to Willow Creek, however brief your stay may be." With that, he rose from the table, navigating with surprising ease through the cafe. At the door, he paused and turned back, though he couldn't see her. "Miss Thompson? For what it's worth, I think Thomas Reynolds made a grave error in judgment. Today." Then he was gone, leaving Eleanor with a cooling cup of coffee, a half-eaten slice of pie, and a decision to make. Sarah approached, coffee pot in hand. "Refill, dear?" Eleanor nodded gratefully. "Yes, please." As Sarah poured, she studied Eleanor with kind but shrewd eyes. "I couldn't help overhearing some of your conversation with Mason. He's a good man. You know, one of the best in these parts. You know him well?" "Since he was knee-high to a grasshopper," Sarah confirmed. "His father established that ranch from nothing but scrub and determination. When Mason lost his sight, everyone said he'd have to sell up, but he proved them wrong. Learned new ways to run the place, hired good men, and that ranch is more prosperous now than ever before." Eleanor absently stirred her coffee. "And Mrs. Abernathy, what's she like?" Sarah chuckled. "Tough as old boots and twice as reliable. Heart of gold underneath all that bluster. Been with the Walkers for 30 years. She leaned closer. "Between you and me, she's been threatening to retire for at least 5 of those years, but she won't leave Mason until she's sure he's properly looked after." "And you think I might be suitable?" Eleanor couldn't keep the doubt from her voice. "Honey, I've been serving coffee and pie in this town for 27 years. I've seen all kinds come through those doors. You've got a gentle way about you, but there's steel underneath." Sarah straightened, adjusting her apron. "And if you're wondering about Mason's character, know this. He could have married any girl in the county after he came back from that. A fancy Eastern school, even after the accident. But he never seemed to find the right match. I'm not considering marriage, Just Sarah, dear, and I know you're not. I'm just telling you that Mason Walker doesn't offer jobs out of pity. If he's offered you a position, it's because he thinks you can do it." With that, she moved to tend to other customers, leaving Eleanor to her thoughts. For the next hour, Eleanor sat in the quiet corner of Sarah's cafe, weighing her options. Return to Boston with nothing but painful memories and uncertain prospects. Or stay in this wild territory, working for a blind rancher she'd just met. The more she considered, the clearer her path became. Boston held nothing for her now. At least here, she had the offer of honest work and a fresh start. By the time the clock on the cafe wall showed 4:45, Eleanor had made her decision. She gathered her suitcase, left a small tip from the money Mason had provided, and stepped out into the afternoon sunlight. The general store sat at the end of the main street, its wide porch stacked with barrels and crates. As Eleanor approached, she spotted Mason speaking with the proprietor, who was loading supplies into a buckboard wagon. Mason's head turned slightly at the sound of her footsteps on the wooden porch. "Miss Thompson?" he called, a note of question in his voice. "Yes, Mr. Walker," she replied, stepping closer. "I've considered your offer and I'd like to accept the position if it's still available." The smile that broke across Mason's face was genuine and warm. "It is, indeed. I'm glad to hear it." He extended his hand, and this time Eleanor took it, firmly in her own. "Welcome to the Double W Ranch, Miss Thompson," he said. "I think this may be the beginning of something quite remarkable for both of us." As the wagon rolled out of town toward the distant mountains, Eleanor couldn't help but feel that despite the day's earlier heartbreak, she might have found something far more valuable than what she'd originally come seeking. Not a husband determined to improve his social standing, but honest work, respect, and perhaps in time, a place to truly belong. The journey to the Double W Ranch took just over an hour, giving Eleanor time to absorb the vastness of the Montana landscape. Rugged mountains framed the horizon, their peaks still dusted with snow despite the spring thaw. The wagon rolled through meadows exploding with wildflowers and crossed burbling streams swollen with meltwater. It was breathtakingly beautiful, yet intimidating in its raw power. Mason sat beside her on the wagon bench, occasionally pointing out landmarks. The lightning-struck oak that marked the turnoff to neighboring Jenkins' property, the outcropping of rocks where mountain sheep sometimes gathered, the narrow pass that offered shelter during winter storms. Though he couldn't see these things anymore, he described them with the vivid detail of someone who had once known them intimately and still carried their images in his memory. "You navigate this land remarkably well for someone who cannot see it," Eleanor observed. Mason's hands remained steady on the reins as he guided the team of horses. "I spent 23 years memorizing every inch of this territory before I lost my sight. The accident took my vision, not my knowledge." He smiled slightly. "Besides, these horses know the way home better than I ever did. May I ask about your accident?" Eleanor ventured cautiously. Mason was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor feared she had overstepped. But when he spoke, his voice was matter-of-fact rather than pained. "I was 29, just taken over full management of the ranch from my father. We'd purchased a new stallion from a breeder in Kentucky, magnificent animal, but spirited. I was showing him off to some neighboring ranchers, pushing him too hard on unfamiliar terrain. He stumbled in a prairie dog hole through me. My head struck a rock." He shrugged. "Woke up 3 days later with darkness where the world used to be." "I'm so sorry," Eleanor murmured. "Took me 2 years to stop being sorry for myself," Mason replied frankly. "Then Mrs. Abernathy told me I could either learn to live without sight or she'd find someone who would make better use of the air I was breathing." His laugh held genuine amusement. "You'll understand when you meet her. Not a woman who tolerates self-pity. She sounds formidable. That she is. But she's also the reason I didn't lose the ranch. She and Daniel Pearson, my foreman, they kept everything running while I learned how to be blind." The wagon slowed as they approached a wooden bridge spanning a creek. "Duck your head low here, tree. Branches hang lower than they should. I keep meaning to have the hands trim them." Eleanor obediently lowered her head as they crossed, noticing how Mason did the same from memory alone. "The ranch is just beyond that rise," Mason explained as they climbed a gentle slope. "You'll see the outbuildings first, then the main house. It's not as grand as what Thomas Reynolds might have offered, but it's solid and comfortable." As they crested the hill, the Double W spread before them. A cluster of well-maintained buildings formed a rough semicircle around a central yard. The main house was a substantial 2-story structure built of timber and riverstone, with a wide veranda wrapping around its front. Smoke curled from the chimney, and lamplight glowed in the windows against the approaching dusk. To the left stood a long, low bunkhouse, a barn and various outbuildings. To the right, a smaller cabin that Eleanor assumed belonged to the foreman and his wife. Beyond the buildings, fenced pastures stretched toward distant hills where cattle grazed. "It's lovely," Eleanor said sincerely. Mason's expression softened. "Thank you. My father built the original cabin, and I added on to it after returning from college. The east-facing windows catch the morning light particularly well in the kitchen." A shadow crossed his face, or so I'm told. As they approached the yard, a stocky man in his 40s emerged from the barn, raising a hand in greeting before realizing Mason couldn't see it. "Evening, boss," he called instead. "Daniel," Mason acknowledged. "This is Miss Eleanor Thompson. She'll be assisting Mrs. Abernathy. Miss Thompson, Daniel Pearson, the finest foreman in the territory." Daniel touched his hat politely. "Ma'am, welcome to the Double W." "Thank you, Mr. Pearson. Daniel, would you mind unloading the supplies? I'll show Miss Thompson to the house." "Happy to, boss." Daniel moved to the back of the wagon as Mason handed Eleanor down from the bench. "The ground's a bit uneven here," Mason warned, offering his arm. 7 steps to the porch, then 3 up. Eleanor placed her hand on his arm, noticing how he walked with confidence across familiar terrain. As they approached the house, the front door swung open to reveal a stern-faced woman with iron-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her apron was spotless, her posture ramrod straight despite her advanced years. "About time you got back," she announced. "Supper's nearly ready and those ranch hands of yours are like circling wolves." Her sharp eyes assessed Eleanor from head to toe. "This the new girl?" "Mrs. Abernathy, may I present Miss Eleanor Thompson?" Mason said with exaggerated formality. That suggested he was well accustomed to the housekeeper's brusque manner. "Miss Thompson, Mrs. Harriet Abernathy, without whom this ranch would have collapsed years ago." Mrs. Abernathy gave a short nod. "Well, don't just stand there letting the flies in. Come inside and wash up." She turned on her heel and disappeared. Into the house, Mason leaned slightly toward Eleanor. "Don't let her intimidate you. Her bark is considerably worse than her bite." "He heard that, Mason Walker?" Mrs. Abernathy's voice called from inside. Mason grinned, unrepentant, and led Eleanor into the house. The interior of the ranch house was far more refined than Eleanor had expected. The entrance opened into a spacious living area with polished wooden floors partially covered by colorful woven rugs. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel adorned with a clock and several framed photographs. Comfortable-looking furniture was arranged for conversation, and bookshelves lined the wall opposite the fireplace. Mason insisted on keeping everything exactly where it was before the accident, Mrs. Abernathy explained, noticing Eleanor's appraisal. "Makes it easier for him to navigate. You'll need to remember that. Don't move anything without telling him." "Of course," Eleanor agreed. "Kitchen's through here," Mrs. Abernathy continued, leading them through a doorway. "Dining room to the right. We only use it for Sunday dinners and special occasions. Ranch hands eat at the big table here in the kitchen." The kitchen was clearly the heart of the house, warm, fragrant with cooking smells, and impeccably organized. A massive wood-burning stove gleamed with care, and copper pots hung from a rack above the central work table. Through another doorway, Eleanor glimpsed a small bedroom with a narrow bed, simple dresser, and tiny window. "That'll be your room," Mrs. Abernathy stated, following her gaze. "Mine's on the other side of the kitchen, Mason's upstairs along, with the guest rooms, though we rarely have visitors who stay overnight." "It's perfect," Eleanor said sincerely. After the uncertainty of the day, the prospect of a private room and stable employment felt like an extraordinary blessing. Mrs. Abernathy's expression softened fractionally. "Well, you can get settled after supper. For now, wash up and help me. Get the food on the table. Ranch hands will be in directly." Mason, who had been standing quietly during this exchange, spoke up. "I have some correspondence to review before supper. Perhaps Miss Thompson could assist me with that tomorrow morning." 9 o'clock in the study, Mrs. Abernathy agreed. "After." breakfast, clean-up. With that established, Mason excused himself, moving with practiced ease through the house. Eleanor watched him go, still marveling at his confidence despite his blindness. "You'll get used to it," Mrs. Abernathy said, correctly interpreting her expression. "Now those potatoes won't mash themselves." The next 2 hours passed in a whirlwind as Eleanor helped serve dinner to 8 hungry men, Mason, Daniel, and 6 ranch hands, whose names blurred together in her exhaustion. They were all polite, if curious, about her presence, and Eleanor found herself relaxing slightly in the warm, noisy kitchen, filled with their good-natured banter and Mrs. Abernathy's tart rejoinders. After the meal, when the men had retired to the bunkhouse or their own quarters, Mrs. Abernathy showed Eleanor to her small room. "It ain't much," the older woman acknowledged, "but it's private and clean." "It's wonderful," Eleanor assured her, sinking onto the edge of the bed. The mattress was firm but comfortable, covered with a handmade quilt in shades of blue and green. Mrs. Abernathy studied her with sharp eyes. "Mason told me some of your circumstances. That Reynolds fellow is a fool, if you ask me, which nobody did. Still," she crossed her arms, "this isn't charity. There's real work needed here, and I expect you to pull your weight." "I understand completely," Eleanor said. "I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I intend to earn my keep." Something that might have been approval flickered in the housekeeper's eyes. "Get some rest. Morning comes early on a ranch." She turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Mason's a good man, the best I know. But he doesn't need anyone's pity, understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Breakfast at 6. With that she withdrew, closing the door behind her. Left alone, Eleanor unpacked her meager belongings, changed into her nightgown, and slipped beneath the quilt. Despite the day's emotional turmoil, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep almost immediately. Dawn came with the crowing of roosters and the distant lowing of cattle. Eleanor woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. As memories of the previous day flooded back, she dressed quickly in one of her 2 serviceable dresses and pinned her hair into a simple bun. When she entered the kitchen, Mrs. Abernathy was already at work, stoking the stove and mixing biscuit dough. "Good, you're up," the older woman said. "Coffee's ready. Pour yourself a cup, then start on the bacon. Men will be in soon." The morning passed in a blur of activity. Cooking, serving, cleaning up after the ranch hands devoured their substantial breakfast. Mrs. Abernathy proved to be an exacting taskmaster, but also an excellent teacher, explaining her systems and expectations clearly. At precisely 9 o'clock, Mrs. Abernathy pointed Eleanor toward a door off the main living area. "Study's in there. Mason's waiting." Eleanor knocked lightly on the door. "Come in, Miss Thompson," Mason called. The study was a handsome room with the same attention to order Eleanor had observed throughout the house. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a large oak desk stood before a window overlooking the eastern pastures. Mason sat behind the desk, his fingers trailing over what appeared to be a ledger written in a bold, clear hand. "Good morning," he greeted her. "I trust you slept well?" "Very well, thank you," Eleanor replied, taking the seat he indicated across from him. "Excellent. I thought we might start by establishing a routine for handling correspondence and accounts. Mrs. Abernathy has been managing admirably, but her eyesight isn't what it used to be, and frankly, her patience for business matters is limited." "I'd be happy to help." Eleanor smoothed her skirt nervously. "Though I should warn you, my experience is limited to a small bookbinding business." Mason's smile was reassuring. "The principles are the same, just the scale is different." He pushed a stack of envelopes toward her. "These arrived yesterday. Would you mind reading them aloud? The business ones first, if you please." For the next hour, Eleanor read letters from cattle buyers, suppliers, the bank, and various neighbors. Mason listened attentively, occasionally dictating responses for her to write in a clear hand. His memory for details was remarkable. He recalled prices from previous transactions, terms of agreements, and the specifics of conversations held months earlier. "You're very organized," Eleanor observed as they finished the last of the correspondence. "Necessity," Mason replied. "When you can't see, you must keep everything in its proper place, physically and mentally." He leaned back in his chair. "Now tell me about yourself, Miss Thompson, beyond what you shared yesterday." "There's not much to tell," Eleanor demurred. "I disagree. A woman who travels across the country alone, based on exchanged letters, strikes me as someone with a story worth hearing." Eleanor hesitated, then found herself sharing more than she'd intended. Her childhood in Boston as the daughter of a bookbinder, her love of literature fostered by parents who valued education, her dreams of someday writing stories of her own, and the devastating fever that had claimed her family, leaving her alone at 24. "I managed to keep the shop going for almost 2 years, she explained, "but without Father's skill at the actual binding, we lost customers. When Mr. Reynolds's advertisement appeared in the newspaper, it seemed providential. And now here, you are reading correspondence to a blind rancher instead," Mason said, his tone gently self-deprecating. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "though I must say, this is turning out to be far less intimidating than becoming Mrs. Thomas Reynolds would have been." Mason laughed, a rich, genuine sound that transformed his serious face. "Well, I'm selfishly glad for Reynolds' poor judgment. Mrs. Abernathy has been threatening to retire to her daughter's home for years. I've been dreading the day she finally makes good on that threat." "She seems devoted to you," Eleanor observed. "To the ranch," Mason corrected. "She practically raised me after my mother died. I was 10. His expression sobered. "She and my father kept this place going through drought, harsh winters, and falling beef prices. When Father passed 7 years ago, she stayed on when she could have sought an easier position. And then you had your accident." Mason nodded. "I'm not sure I would have survived those first dark months without her stubbornness. She simply refused to accept that I couldn't run this ranch anymore." His fingers tapped thoughtfully on the lay desk. There's a strength in that kind of loyalty that's rare in this world. Something in his tone made Eleanor wonder if he was thinking of more than just Mrs. Abernathy. But before she could respond, a knock sounded at the study door. "Come in," Mason called. Daniel Pearson entered, hat in hand. "Sorry to interrupt, boss, but that new bull is acting up something fierce in the north pasture. Thought you'd want to know." Mason rose immediately. "Is anyone hurt?" "No, sir, but he's charging the fence line. Jim thinks he might break through if we don't move him to the reinforced enclosure." "I'll come right away." Mason turned toward Eleanor. "We'll continue this later, Miss Thompson. In the meantime, perhaps you could organize these invoices by a date. Mrs. Abernathy can show you where they're filed." With that, he followed Daniel from the room, moving with the same confident stride Eleanor had observed before. Watching him navigate the doorway without hesitation, she marveled again at his adaptation to blindness. Left alone in the study, Eleanor began sorting the invoices as requested. Each was marked with a date in the same bold handwriting she'd noticed. In the ledger, presumably Mrs. Abernathy's, the organization system was logical but could be improved. Eleanor found herself mentally redesigning it as she worked. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Abernathy stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Mason went to handle that temperamental bull," she stated. "Could be a while. You might as well help me with dinner preparations." Eleanor followed her to the kitchen, where Mrs. Abernathy set her to peeling potatoes for the evening meal. "Mason seems very capable despite his blindness," Eleanor ventured after they had worked in silence for several minutes. Mrs. Abernathy's knife paused briefly in its rhythmic chopping of onions. "He is now. Wasn't always. First year after the accident he was lost, angry, wouldn't come downstairs for days at a time." "What changed?" The older woman resumed chopping. Winter of '80 was brutal. Blizzard came through, temperatures dropped to 20 below. Two of the hands got caught out in it while checking the herd. One of them, young Joey Matthews, just 19 years old, got separated in the whiteout. Eleanor's hands stilled on the potato she was peeling. Daniel organized a search party, but the conditions were worsening. Too dangerous, he said. Mrs. Abernathy's voice hardened with the memory, and then Mason came downstairs, demanded his coat and gloves, said he might not have his eyes, but he had the best knowledge of the north section where Joey was last seen. Said the terrain was mapped in his head better than any of them could see it, even in clear conditions. Did they let him go? Wasn't a matter of letting. Mason Walker owned this ranch. Daniel tried to talk sense into him, but Mason said something. I'll never forget. Mrs. Abernathy set down her knife, turning to face Eleanor fully. A man's value isn't in what he's lost, but in what he still has to give. Then he took a rope, tied it to his belt, and told Daniel to hold the other end. Said he'd use his other senses, the feel of the land, the direction of the wind, the sound of the creek even under ice. And did they find the boy? Eleanor asked softly. Mrs. Abernathy nodded once. Joey had fallen into a ravine, broken his leg, was nearly frozen when they found him. Mason heard his faint calls when the others couldn't, said losing his sight had sharpened his hearing. She picked up her knife again. After that, something changed in him, started learning new ways to run the ranch. Had Daniel describe everything in detail, walked every inch of the property with a guide until he could do it alone. Started using his hands to see the cattle, judge their health by touch and sound. That's remarkable, Eleanor murmured. It's who he is, Mrs. Abernathy said simply. Now those potatoes won't peel themselves. They worked in companionable silence for a time before Mrs. Abernathy spoke again. He needs help, you know. Not with blindness. He's mastered that as much as any man could. But running this place involves papers and numbers and letters, things I can read to him, but I'm no businesswoman. I'll do my best to assist him, Eleanor promised. See that you do. Mrs. Abernathy's tone was brisk, but her eyes held a warmth that belied her stern words. And understand this, Mason Walker deserves someone who sees him clearly, blindness and all. Before Eleanor could respond to this cryptic statement, the back door opened, and Mason entered, bringing with him the scent of fresh air and horses. Bulls contained, he announced, though I think we'll need to consider selling him if his temperament doesn't improve. Daniel says his bloodlines aren't worth the risk to the hands. Told you that animal was trouble when you bought him, Mrs. Abernathy muttered. Mason smiled ruefully. Yes, you did. Add it to your list of correct predictions. He turned his face toward the stove. Something smells delicious. Beef stew, Mrs. Abernathy replied. Miss Thompson's been helping. Excellent. I hope you'll join me for lunch in the dining room, Miss Thompson. We can continue our discussion starting this morning. Eleanor glanced at Mrs. Abernathy, who gave a short nod. I'd be delighted, Mr. Walker. Wonderful. I'll just wash up and meet you there in 15 minutes. As he left the kitchen, Mrs. Abernathy fixed Eleanor with a penetrating stare. Remember what I said. Mason Walker doesn't need pity or coddling. What he needs is someone who sees his strength, not his limitations. With that enigmatic comment hanging in the air, the housekeeper turned back to her stew, leaving Eleanor to wonder exactly what Mrs. Abernathy thought she saw between her employer and his newly hired assistant. The weeks that followed settled into a comfortable rhythm at the Double W Ranch. Each morning Eleanor rose with the sun to help Mrs. Abernathy prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. Afterwards, she spent several hours in the study with Mason, reading correspondence, organizing accounts, and learning the intricacies of the cattle business. The afternoons were devoted to household tasks, mending, preserving spring vegetables from the kitchen garden, and assisting with dinner preparations. To Eleanor's surprise, she found genuine satisfaction in the work. Unlike the struggling bookbindery in Boston, where each day brought new financial worries, the Double W operated with reassuring stability. Mason ran the ranch with a combination of shrewd business sense and genuine concern for both his livestock and his employees. His blindness, she realized, was merely an inconvenience he had adapted to, not the defining aspect of his character. Their morning sessions in the study gradually extended as spring bloomed into early summer. What began as strictly business discussions evolved into wide-ranging conversations about books, politics, and their differing experiences of the world. Mason had attended Harvard before returning to Montana to help his father run the ranch, and his education, combined with Eleanor's voracious reading habits, ensured they never lacked for topics. "You surprise me, Miss Thompson," Mason remarked one morning as Eleanor finished reading a passage from Emerson's essays that had been referenced in a letter from his former college roommate. "How so?" she asked, closing the book. "You speak of these philosophers as old friends. Not many in Willow Creek have read Emerson, let alone formed opinions on his ideas." Eleanor smiled, though she knew he couldn't see it. "My father believed education shouldn't be limited by gender. He taught me alongside the apprentices in the bookbindery, a progressive thinker. Yes, Mother was scandalized when he insisted I learn mathematics beyond simple household accounting, but he prevailed." Eleanor's voice softened with the memory. "He said a mind was too precious a gift to leave half-developed." "A wise man," Mason said. "I wish I could have met him." "He would have liked you," Eleanor replied honestly. "He valued authenticity above all else." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of ranch work drifting through the open window, men calling to each other, the rhythmic pounding of a hammer on the new fence section, the lowing of cattle in the south. "In pasture, Eleanor," Mason said suddenly, using her given name for the first time. "Would you mind describing the view from the window?" The request caught her off guard, but she moved to the window without hesitation. "The sky is the most remarkable shade of blue today, deep and clear, with just a few wispy clouds to the west. The mountains look almost purple in this light, with patches of snow still visible on the highest peaks." As she continued describing the scene, the new grass in the pasture, the wildflowers dotting the hillside, the hawks circling lazily overhead, Mason closed his eyes, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you," he said when she finished. "I can almost see it." "Do you miss it terribly?" she asked softly. Being able to see, Mason considered the question carefully. "I miss colors the most, the particular blue of the Montana sky in June, the way sunset turns the mountains, gold then pink then purple. The autumn aspen leaves like coins, flashing in the sun." He shrugged slightly. "But I've discovered compensations. I hear things others miss, the different songs in the wind before a storm versus before a clear day. I can tell which of my horses is approaching by the rhythm of their gait long before others know they're coming. That's remarkable. Necessity," Mason said with a self-deprecating smile. "Though I'd trade it all to see a sunrise again." He straightened in his chair, his expression shifting back to businesslike. "Now, I believe we have the cattle sale contracts to review before lunch." The moment of intimacy had passed, but it marked a subtle shift in their relationship. From that day forward, Eleanor began describing the world to Mason without being asked, the first wild rose blooms of the season, the way the afternoon light filtered through the cottonwood trees by the creek, the expressions on people's faces. During Sunday services at the small church in Willow Creek, if Mrs. Abernathy noticed this growing closeness, she made no comment, though Eleanor sometimes caught the older woman watching them with an inscrutable expression during their shared meals or evening conversations on the porch. One Saturday afternoon in late June, as Eleanor helped Mrs. Abernathy preserve strawberries from the kitchen garden, The housekeeper broke her silence on the matter. "Mason's looking better these days," she observed, carefully ladling hot preserves into glass jars. Smiling more, Eleanor concentrated on wiping the rims of the jars clean. "The ranch is doing well. The new breeding program he implemented is showing promising results." Mrs. Abernathy snorted softly. "Been running this ranch 6 years since his accident. Business has been good before. This is different." Not knowing how to respond, Eleanor remained silent. "My sister in Oregon has been after me to move there for years," Mrs. Abernathy continued, seemingly changing the subject. "Says the climate would be better for my joints in winter." Eleanor looked up in alarm. "You're not considering leaving, are you?" "Depends." The older woman fixed her with a penetrating stare. "On whether I think Mason will be properly looked after if I go." Heat rose in Eleanor's cheeks. "Mrs. Abernathy, I'm not sure what you're implying, but my relationship with Mr. Walker is strictly professional." "Never said it wasn't." Mrs. Abernathy sealed the last jar with practiced efficiency. "Just observing that he laughs more readily these days, seems more at ease." She wiped her hands on her apron. "And you've stopped looking over your shoulder like you expect that Reynolds fellow to appear and drag you back to town." Before Eleanor could formulate a response, they were interrupted by the sound of horses in the yard. Voices called out, "Daniels," raised in greeting, followed by a stranger's reply. Mrs. Abernathy moved to the window. "Company," she announced. "Looks like the new doctor from town." She bustled to the stove to put on coffee, while Eleanor wiped strawberry juice from her hands. By the time they had composed themselves, Mason was leading a visitor into the kitchen. "Mrs. Abernathy, Miss Thompson, may I present Dr. William Hargrove," Mason said formally. "He's recently taken over Dr. Peterson's practice in Willow Creek. Dr. Hargrove, my housekeeper, Mrs. Harriet Abernathy, and my assistant, Miss Eleanor Thompson." Dr. Hargrove was a tall, handsome man of about 35, with sandy hair and an easy smile. He bowed slightly to both women. "Ladies, a pleasure. I'm making the rounds of the outlying ranches to introduce myself." "Coffee's almost ready," Mrs. Abernathy said. "You're welcome to join us." "I'd be delighted." As they settled around the kitchen table with coffee and freshly baked biscuits, Dr. Hargrove explained his background: medical training in Chicago, a practice in Denver, and now seeking the challenges and rewards of rural medicine in Montana. "Willow Creek is fortunate to have you," Mason said. "Dr. Peterson was well past retirement age." "Indeed, he's been most helpful in the transition, familiarizing me with the particular health challenges of the area." The doctor's gaze lingered on Eleanor. "Though he failed to mention all the charming aspects of my new home." Eleanor felt herself blush under his open admiration, acutely aware of Mason's suddenly still expression. "Miss Thompson is from Boston," Mason said, his tone neutral. "She's been an invaluable addition to our household these past 2 months." Dr. Hargrove's eyebrows raised. "Boston? What brings a city lady to our remote corner of the territory?" Before Eleanor could respond, Mrs. Abernathy intervened with surprising tact. "Opportunity, same as most who come west." "More coffee, doctor?" The conversation shifted to the health of the community, the plans for a proper hospital building to replace Dr. Peterson's front parlor surgery, and the upcoming Independence Day celebration in town. "I do hope you'll all attend," Dr. Hargrove said, as he prepared to leave an hour later. "The committee has planned quite an impressive program, including fireworks shipped all the way from Chicago." "Wouldn't miss it," Mason assured him, walking him to the door. "Daniel will show you around the property before you go, if you're interested. We've implemented some new health protocols for the herd that might interest you from a public health perspective." When the men had departed, Mrs. Abernathy gave Eleanor a knowing look. "Handsome man, the doctor, I suppose," Eleanor replied non-committally, busying herself with clearing the coffee cups. "Clearly interested in you," Eleanor's hands still. "Mrs. Abernathy, I have no interest in Dr. Hargrove's attention." "Didn't say you did." The older woman's expression was unreadable. "Just making an observation." The Independence Day celebration arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, a gentle breeze, and temperatures mild enough for comfort. The entire population of Willow Creek and the surrounding ranches gathered in the town's square, which had been decorated with bunting and flags for the occasion. The W contingent arrived in force: Mason, Eleanor, Mrs. Abernathy, Daniel, and his wife Martha, and all 6 ranch hands, freshly bathed and wearing their Sunday best. They joined the festivities with enthusiasm, the men participating in horseshoe tournaments and shooting competitions, while Eleanor and Mrs. Abernathy helped judge the baking contests. "Miss Thompson!" Dr. Hargrove appeared at Eleanor's side as she recorded the scores for Mrs. Jenkins' apple pie. "You look absolutely radiant today," Eleanor thanked him politely, conscious of curious glances from townspeople nearby. Her gingham dress was simple compared to the elaborate ensembles worn by the banker's wife and the mayor's daughter, but she had taken special care with her appearance, pinning her hair in a more flattering style and adding a ribbon Mrs. Abernathy had insisted she borrow. "I was hoping you might do me the honor of watching the fireworks display in my company this evening," Dr. Hargrove continued. "I've secured a prime viewing location on the hill behind the church." Before Eleanor could formulate a gracious refusal, Mason appeared at her other side, guided by Daniel. "Dr. Hargrove," Mason greeted him. "Enjoying the festivities?" "Immensely," the doctor replied. "In fact, I was just inviting Miss Thompson to view the fireworks with me later." A barely perceptible tension appeared in Mason's jawline. "I see. Well, Miss Thompson is certainly free to accept or decline as she wishes." Something in his carefully neutral tone decided Eleanor. "Thank you for the invitation, Dr. Hargrove, but I've already promised to help Mrs. Abernathy with our contribution to the community supper. Perhaps another time." If the doctor was disappointed, he concealed it well. "Of course, the offer remains open should your duties conclude early." After he moved away to speak with the mayor, Daniel excused himself as well, leaving Eleanor and Mason standing somewhat awkwardly among the bustle of the celebration. "You didn't need to decline on my account," Mason said quietly, "or Mrs. Abernathy's. We could manage the supper preparations without you." Eleanor studied his face, wishing she could read the thoughts behind those sightless eyes. "I wasn't being polite. I genuinely prefer to remain with the ranch family." Mason's expression softened. "In that case, would you describe the scene for me? It's been years since I attended a town celebration, and I find I've forgotten the details." Eleanor took his arm, guiding him to a bench beneath a cottonwood tree, where they could sit somewhat apart from the crowd. As she described the decorations, the competitions, the children running with streamers, and the ladies comparing their picnic baskets, Mason listened with his characteristic intense focus, occasionally asking questions that revealed his genuine interest in the community he could no longer see. "Thank you," he said when she had finished. "You have a gift for bringing images to life with words." "It's easy when the subject is so vibrant," Eleanor replied, "though I suspect my descriptions fall short of reality." "Not at all. In fact, I sometimes think I see more clearly through your eyes than I did with my own." Mason's hand found hers on the bench between them, covering it briefly. "Your perspective adds dimensions I might have missed even with perfect sight." The simple touch sent warmth spreading through Eleanor's chest. Before she could respond, however, Mrs. Abernathy appeared before them. "There you are," she announced. "They're about to start the speeches, and the mayor specifically asked if you'd be seated at the front, Mason, being one of the largest landowners in the county." The moment they broke, they rose to join the gathering crowd. As they made their way forward, Eleanor became aware of curious glances and whispered comments from the townspeople. She caught fragments, mail-order bride, and Reynolds, and working for the blind rancher now, that made her cheeks burn with humiliation. "Ignore them," Mason murmured, somehow sensing her discomfort despite his blindness. "Small towns run on gossip, but it fades when they find a newer topic." "Miss Thompson." Eleanor turned to find Thomas Reynolds himself approaching, impeccably dressed and accompanied by a stylish young woman whose elaborately curled blonde hair and fashionable dress marked her as a city transplant. "Mr. Reynolds," Eleanor acknowledged stiffly. "What a pleasant surprise," Reynolds said, though his expression suggested it was anything but pleasant. "I'd heard you found alternative employment." His gaze flicked dismissively to Mason. "Indeed." Eleanor lifted her chin. "Mr. Walker, may I present Mr. Thomas Reynolds, Mr. Reynolds, Mason Walker of the Double W Ranch." "We've met," Mason said coolly, "at the Cattlemen's Association meeting last winter." Reynolds barely acknowledged him before continuing. "Allow me to introduce my fiancée, Miss Josephine Caldwell, who recently arrived from San Francisco. Her father is a business associate of mine." Miss Caldwell offered a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Charmed, I'm sure." Eleanor murmured an appropriate response, acutely aware of the contrast between her simple gingham dress and Miss Caldwell's silk ensemble. The awkward moment was mercifully interrupted by the mayor calling for everyone to take their seats for the Independence Day address. "Well, we mustn't keep the mayor waiting," Reynolds said. "Do enjoy the festivities, Miss Thompson." The dismissive tone made it clear he considered her beneath his notice now that he had secured a more suitable bride. As Reynolds led his fiancée away, Eleanor found herself trembling with a complex mixture of emotions, lingering humiliation from his initial rejection, fresh indignation at his condescension, and most surprisingly, a profound sense of relief that fate had intervened to prevent her from becoming Mrs. Thomas Reynolds. "Are you all right?" Mason asked quietly as Daniel helped him to his designated seat near the front. "Perfectly," Eleanor replied, and was surprised to discover she meant it. "In fact, I believe I've just received confirmation that what initially seemed a devastating setback was actually an extraordinary stroke of good fortune." The afternoon progressed with speeches, a reading of the Declaration of Independence by the schoolmaster, and community singing of patriotic songs. As dusk approached, tables were arranged in the town square for the communal supper. Eleanor helped. Mrs. Abernathy arranged their contributions: fried chicken, potato salad, and strawberry preserves spread on fresh biscuits. Throughout the meal, Eleanor was conscious of Dr. Hargrove watching her from several tables away, his interest obvious. To anyone paying attention, she was equally aware of Mason beside her, unusually quiet as he navigated the challenges of eating in public without the benefit of sight. "You're being watched," Mrs. Abernathy muttered as they cleared plates after the meal. "I know," Eleanor sighed. "Dr. Hargrove has been quite persistent. Not just the doctor," the housekeeper corrected. "Half the town is watching to see what happens between you, him, and Mason." "That's ridiculous," Eleanor protested. "There's nothing to see." Mrs. Abernathy snorted softly. "For a smart woman, you can be remarkably blind yourself sometimes." Before Eleanor could demand an explanation for this cryptic comment, the first test rocket whistled into the air, signaling the start of the fireworks display. The crowd moved en masse toward the open field where viewing would be best. Dr. Hargrove materialized at Eleanor's side. "My offer still stands, Miss Thompson. The view from the church hill is unparalleled." Eleanor hesitated, searching the crowd for Mason. She spotted him standing somewhat apart from the others, his expression carefully neutral as Daniel described the initial fireworks to him. "Thank you, Doctor, but I believe I'll stay with my employer," she said firmly. "He can't see the display, but he can still be part of the celebration." Something like disappointment flashed across the doctor's handsome face, quickly replaced by a gracious smile. "Of course." Another time, perhaps. He tipped his hat and moved away. Eleanor made her way to Mason's side, just as another rocket burst overhead in a shower of red and gold sparks. "Eleanor!" Mason turned toward the sound of her approach. "I thought you might be watching from the church hill." "He'd rather watch from here," she said simply, taking her place beside him. "If you don't mind the company." A genuine smile spread across his face. "I would welcome it." He paused as another explosion lit the night sky, reflected in the upturned faces of the crowd. "Will you describe them to me?" "With pleasure." As the fireworks continued, Eleanor painted verbal pictures of each brilliant display. The cascading silver stars, the golden willows weeping light, the red and blue bursts that elicited gasps from the onlookers. Standing close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed, she was acutely aware of Mason's presence beside her, solid and steady in the darkness illuminated by fleeting artificial stars. When the grand finale erupted in a cacophony of light and sound, the crowd burst into applause. In the moment of collective joy, Mason's hand found Eleanor's, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible above the cheering crowd, "for sharing your vision." Under the fading glow of the last fireworks, with the scent of gunpowder hanging in the air and the townspeople beginning to disperse around them, Eleanor realized with sudden clarity that Mrs. Abernathy had been right. Something had changed between her and Mason, something profound and potentially life-altering. The revelation should have frightened her. Instead, she found herself tightening her grip on Mason's hand, anchoring them both in the darkness as the temporary lights faded from the Montana sky. The journey back to the Double W Ranch after the Independence Day celebration was filled with a charged silence. Eleanor sat beside Mason in the wagon, her hands still tingling from where his fingers had intertwined with hers during the fireworks. Neither spoke of what had transpired, but something fundamental had shifted between them, a boundary crossed that could not be re-established. Mrs. Abernathy, seated behind them with Daniel and Martha Pearson, maintained an uncharacteristic silence, though Eleanor could feel the older woman's knowing gaze on her back throughout the moonlit ride home. The following days brought a flurry of activity that left little time for private conversations. A sudden thunderstorm damaged the roof of the barn, requiring all hands to make repairs before another storm could worsen the situation. Then one of the prize heifers developed complications during calving, necessitating Mason's full attention as he worked alongside Daniel to save both mother and calf. Through it all, Eleanor found herself watching Mason with new awareness. The confident way he moved through spaces he couldn't see, the gentle patience he showed with the injured heifer, the quiet authority he commanded among the ranch hands. These were not new qualities, she realized, but her perception of them had transformed. What she had initially viewed as admirable adaptations to blindness, she now recognized as the essential character of the man himself. A week after the Independence Day celebration, the opportunity for private conversation finally presented itself. Mrs. Abernathy announced her intention to spend the day in town with her quilting circle, leaving Eleanor to manage the household alone. "I've left cold chicken and potato salad in the larder for lunch," she informed Eleanor as she donned her Sunday bonnet. "Mason will be back from the north pasture by noon. The hands are taking their meal at the line shack today." The meaningful look that accompanied this information was not lost on Eleanor. "Is there anything specific you'd like me to accomplish in your absence?" she asked, deliberately focusing on practical matters. "Just keep things running," Mrs. Abernathy replied vaguely. "You know the routine by now." With that, she departed, leaving Eleanor alone in the quiet house. The morning passed swiftly as she tackled the weekly mending and prepared fresh bread for the evening meal. Just before noon, she heard hoofbeats approaching and moved to the window to see Mason dismounting from his horse, with practiced ease. He moved confidently across the yard, his boots finding the familiar path to the house without hesitation. Eleanor smoothed her hair and straightened her apron, then chided herself for the girlish gesture. "Eleanor!" Mason called as he entered through the kitchen door. "Something smells wonderful." "Fresh bread," she replied, pleased that her voice sounded normal, despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "It's just cooling. Mrs. Abernathy left cold chicken for lunch." "Ah, yes, quilting circle day." Mason hung his hat on the peg by the door. "The one day a month when Mrs. Abernathy abandons her post to gossip with the other ranch wives and widows. Believe she called it maintaining essential community connections," Eleanor said with a smile. Mason laughed. "Diplomatic as always. Is there coffee?" "Just brewed." They moved with comfortable familiarity around the kitchen, Eleanor setting out plates while Mason retrieved cups from the cabinet. The routine was familiar, yet charged with new awareness. "I thought we might eat on the porch," Eleanor suggested, glancing at the perfect summer day outside. "The house gets so warm with the baking." "An excellent idea." They settled on the shaded porch with their simple meal spread between them on a small table. The view stretched across the valley to the distant mountains, a panorama of green pastures and blue sky that never failed to take Eleanor's breath away. "It's a beautiful day," she said, automatically falling into her habit of describing their surroundings for Mason. "The meadow grass is rippling like water in the breeze, and the mountains are such a clear blue they almost look painted against. The sky," Mason smiled, his face tilted toward the warmth of the sun. "I can feel it, the particular quality of heat in July, intense but not yet the baking heat of August." They ate in companionable silence for a time. The only sounds were the distant lowing of cattle and the chirping of birds in the cottonwood tree beside the house. "Eleanor," Mason finally said, setting down his coffee cup, "I feel I should address what happened at the Independence Day celebration." Eleanor's heart quickened. "Yes?" "I took a liberty, holding your hand during the fireworks." His expression was earnest, his cloudy blue eyes directed somewhere past her left shoulder. "If I made you uncomfortable, I apologize." "You didn't," she said softly. "Nevertheless, I'm your employer. It was presumptuous of me to—" "Mason." Eleanor surprised herself by reaching across the table to touch his hand, stopping the apology. "You didn't make me uncomfortable. Quite the opposite, in fact." He went still beneath her touch, his expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "What are you saying, Eleanor?" She drew a deep breath, gathering courage. "I'm saying that my feelings for you have evolved beyond what would be appropriate between employer and employee." A tension she hadn't realized Mason was carrying seemed to dissolve from his shoulders. "I've been struggling with the same realization," he admitted. "For weeks now, if I'm honest with myself. What do we do about it?" Eleanor asked, the practical question escaping before she could consider a more romantic response. Mason's laugh held equal parts amusement and relief. "Always direct to the heart of the matter." He turned his hand beneath hers, curling his fingers around her palm. "I suppose the conventional approach would be for me to court you properly, if you're amenable." "Court me," Eleanor echoed, "while I continue to live under your roof and work in your household." "An admittedly complex situation," Mason acknowledged. "Mrs. Abernathy would serve as chaperone, of course, though I suspect she's been orchestrating this development all along. You notice that too?" "She's about as subtle as a charging bull," Mason said dryly. "Though in this case I find I can't fault her meddling." Eleanor laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months, perhaps years. "So we court while I continue my duties?" "For now," Mason agreed. "Though if our feelings continue to develop in this direction, we would eventually need to consider a more permanent arrangement." The implication hung in the air between them, neither ready to name it explicitly. Marriage, The very prospect Eleanor had travelled across the country seeking, though with a very different man than the one now holding her hand. "I would like to be courted by you, Mason Walker," she said softly. His smile was radiant. "I'm at a disadvantage, unable to gaze upon your beauty directly, but I hope you'll believe me when I say you've brought light back into my world, Eleanor Thompson." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her. "I believe you," she whispered. Mason lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then we are courting," he declared, "though perhaps we should keep the development to ourselves for a short while. Once Mrs. Abernathy confirms her matchmaking success, we'll never hear the end of it." The weeks that followed took on a golden quality in Eleanor's memory afterward. Long summer days, filled with work and conversation, evenings spent on the porch as she read aloud from novels, while Mason listened attentively, Sunday drives into town for church services, followed by picnic lunches by the creek. True to their agreement, they maintained discretion in public and when the ranch hands were present. But in private moments, walks along the fence line at dusk, quiet conversations in the study after Mrs. Abernathy had retired, their growing affection found expression in held hands, shared confidences, and eventually a first tentative kiss as fireflies danced in the gathering darkness of a July evening. Mrs. Abernathy observed their blossoming relationship with smug satisfaction, but surprisingly without direct comment. She merely adjusted her schedules to provide them with more private moments while maintaining her role as chaperone with proper decorum. Not everyone viewed their relationship with such approval, however. During a trip into Willow Creek for supplies in early August, Eleanor encountered Dr. Hargrove outside the general store. "Miss Thompson," he greeted her, tipping his hat. "A pleasure to see you in town. I was beginning to think Mason Walker had imprisoned you on that ranch of his." "Not at all," Eleanor replied evenly. "I've simply been busy with my duties." "Ah, yes, your duties." The doctor's tone carried an insinuation that brought heat to Eleanor's cheeks. "Town gossip suggests those duties have expanded somewhat beyond household management." Eleanor straightened her spine. "I wasn't aware that my personal life was a subject of medical interest, Dr. Hargrove." "Forgive me," he said, though his expression showed no real contrition. "I speak only out of concern. A woman in your position, dependent on your employer for your livelihood and with limited alternatives, might feel pressured to accept attention she might otherwise reject." The implication was clear and deeply offensive. "I assure you, Doctor, my choices are my own," Eleanor said coldly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to complete my errands." She moved to step around him, but he shifted to block her path. "Eleanor," he said, dropping formality, "I'm expressing this poorly. What I'm trying to say is that you have options. I would be honored if you would consider my suit instead." "Your suit?" Eleanor echoed in disbelief. "Yes, I admired you from our first meeting," Dr. Hargrove continued earnestly. "Your grace, your intelligence. You deserve a husband who can provide for you properly, who can show you the world, who can see you." The emphasis on the last word was unmistakable. Eleanor felt a surge of anger so powerful it momentarily robbed her of speech. "Dr. Hargrove," she finally managed, her voice tight with controlled fury, "your offer is declined, not because I have no options, but because my heart is already engaged elsewhere, and I find your implication that Mason's blindness somehow diminishes his worth. As a man, as a potential husband, deeply offensive." The doctor's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor. The novelty of playing nurse to a crippled rancher will fade, and you'll find yourself trapped in a life of limitation and sacrifice." "The only limitation I see," Eleanor replied, coldly, "is in your own narrow perception." "Good day, Doctor." She pushed past him, trembling with indignation as she completed her errands with mechanical efficiency. By the time she returned to the wagon where Daniel waited to drive her back to the ranch, her anger had cooled to a simmering resolve. That evening, after supper had been cleared, and Mrs. Abernathy had retired to her room with a new catalogue from Montgomery Ward, Eleanor found Mason on the porch, enjoying the cool evening breeze. "May I join you?" she asked, though they were long past such formalities. "Always," he replied, smiling in the direction of her voice. Eleanor settled beside him on the porch swing, gathering her courage. "I had an encounter with Dr. Hargrove in town today." Mason's expression remained neutral, but she felt him tense beside her. "Oh?" She recounted the conversation, omitting only the doctor's most offensive remarks about Mason's blindness. When she finished, silence stretched between them. "Are you going to say anything?" she finally prompted. Mason sighed. "I'm trying to decide whether to be furious with Hargrove or to thank him." "Thank him," Eleanor echoed in confusion. "His presumption forced your hand, made you declare your feelings more definitively than you might have otherwise." Mason turned toward her, his expression serious. "Did you mean it, Eleanor? That your heart is engaged?" "Yes," she said simply. "Completely." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then I think it's time I spoke with Mrs. Abernathy about adjusting your position here at the Double W." Eleanor's breath caught. "What did you have in mind?" "A promotion," Mason said, reaching for her hand, "from employee to partner, from assistant to wife, if you'll have me." The directness of the proposal was so characteristic of Mason that Eleanor found herself laughing even as tears welled in her eyes. Is this how Montana men propose? No bended knee or flowery speeches? "I could attempt both," Mason offered with a wry smile, "but given my inability to see, the kneeling might end with me toppling off the porch, which would somewhat diminish the romantic effect." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "This is perfect just as it is, just as you are. Is that a yes?" Mason asked, suddenly vulnerable despite his earlier confidence. "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Mason Walker." He pulled her into his arms then, his kiss more certain than their previous tentative explorations. When they finally parted, both breathless, Mason pressed his forehead to hers. "I love you, Eleanor Thompson, not because you're my eyes to the world, but because you've helped me see myself clearly again. Before you came, I'd defined myself by what I'd lost. You helped me rediscover all that remained, all that mattered." "I love you too," Eleanor replied, the words falling easily from her lips, though she'd never spoken them to any man before. "When I arrived in Willow Creek, I thought I'd lost everything. My family, my home, my chance at marriage and belonging. But in losing those things, I found my way to you." From the open kitchen window came the unmistakable sound of a throat being cleared. "If you two are quite finished with the speechifying," Mrs. Abernathy's voice called, "I've got a fresh apple pie coming out of the oven. Seems like an occasion worth celebrating." Mason laughed, not releasing Eleanor from his embrace. "Were you eavesdropping, Mrs. Abernathy?" "Certainly not," the housekeeper replied with dignity. "I was simply passing by the window while retrieving a dish towel." "Of course you were," Mason said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe her for a moment. "We'll be right in." As Mrs. Abernathy's footsteps retreated from the window, Mason pressed another quick kiss to Eleanor's lips. "I hope you realize what you're getting into," he murmured. "Mrs. Abernathy comes with the ranch. She'll be managing our lives with iron efficiency until she finally decides to retire to Oregon, which, at this rate, may be never." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Eleanor assured him. The news of their engagement spread through Willow Creek with the speed only possible in a small community. Most reactions were positive. Mason was well respected, and Eleanor had gradually won over the townspeople with her quiet dignity and obvious competence. Some, like Sarah from the cafe, expressed unrestrained delight. Been waiting for that. Man to find happiness again, she told Eleanor when they visited town to purchase fabric for a wedding dress. And you're exactly what he needs. Smart enough to challenge him, kind enough to support him, and strong enough to stand beside him. Others were less enthusiastic. Thomas Reynolds and his fiancée offered stiff congratulations after church one Sunday, his expression suggesting he found the match incomprehensible. Dr. Hargrove avoided them entirely, and rumours circulated that he was considering relocating his practice to Helena. For Eleanor, these reactions were distant concerns, overshadowed by the joy she found in planning their future together. The wedding was set for mid-September, before the harsh Montana winter would make travel difficult for the few distant friends Mason had invited. 2 weeks before the wedding, Eleanor was sorting through her meager possessions, deciding what to move from the small bedroom off the kitchen to the master bedroom she would soon share with Mason, when Mrs. Abernathy appeared in the doorway. "Got something for you," the older woman announced, holding out a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "Wedding present. Thought you should have it before the ceremony." Surprised and touched, Eleanor accepted the package and carefully unwrapped it. Inside lay a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. She opened it to find a tiny, expertly rendered sketch of the W ranch house on one side. The other side was empty. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said sincerely, "but you shouldn't have—" "Wasn't mine to begin with," Mrs. Abernathy interrupted. "It belonged to Mason's mother. His father gave it to her when they first built the ranch. The blank side is for a portrait of your family someday." A rare softness entered her voice. "Mason asked me to give it to you. Said he couldn't see it himself, but he wanted you to have something that connected you to the Walker family history." Eleanor felt tears pricking her eyes. "Thank you for bringing it to me." Mrs. Abernathy nodded brusquely. An emotional moment passed. "He's a good man, deserves happiness. I'll do my best to provide it," Eleanor promised. "See that you do." Mrs. Abernathy turned to leave, then paused. "My sister's still got that spare room in Oregon," she said casually. "Might visit after the wedding, for a month or two." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "But who will manage the household while you're gone?" Mrs. Abernathy fixed her with a pointed look. "Reckon the new Mrs. Walker will manage just fine." With that parting statement, she disappeared down the hall, leaving Eleanor holding the locket and grappling with the realization that Mrs. Abernathy's long-threatened retirement might actually be approaching, a final wedding gift to give the newlyweds privacy to begin their life together. Smiling, Eleanor fastened the locket around her neck, the weight of it unfamiliar but comforting, a tangible connection to the past and a promise for the future. From being left alone at a train station, rejected sight unseen, to finding a man who truly saw her despite his blindness. The journey had been unexpected but perfect in its own way. Outside the window, Mason was returning from the pasture, moving with the confident stride that had first caught her attention. Watching him approach the house, approach their future together, Eleanor touched the locket at her throat and whispered a silent prayer of gratitude for unanswered prayers and the beautiful, unexpected paths they sometimes revealed. September brought the first hints of autumn to Montana. Golden aspen leaves trembling in the breeze, mornings crisp with frost that melted beneath the still, warm midday sun, and the fields around the W ranch turning from vibrant green to amber and bronze. For Eleanor, the changing season mirrored her own transformation as she prepared to become Mrs. Mason Walker. The wedding preparations proceeded with surprising ease, largely due to Mrs. Abernathy's efficient management. The ceremony would be held at the small church in Willow Creek, followed by a celebration at the ranch for neighbors, friends, and the hands who worked the W. Nothing extravagant, Mason had insisted when they discussed their plans. Just honest celebration with the people who matter to us, Eleanor had agreed wholeheartedly. After the public humiliation of being rejected by Thomas Reynolds, she had no desire for a showy event that would invite the town's scrutiny. A week before the wedding, Eleanor was in town with Martha Pearson, the foreman's wife who had become a dear friend, collecting final supplies for the celebration. As they emerged from the general store, arms laden with packages, they nearly collided with Josephine Caldwell, Thomas Reynolds' fiancée. "Miss Thompson," Josephine greeted her with cool politeness. "Mrs. Pearson." "Miss Caldwell," Eleanor acknowledged, equally polite. "How lovely to see you." An awkward silence stretched between them, broken only when Josephine's gaze fell to the packages in Eleanor's arms. "Wedding preparations, I presume?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "Just a few final items." "How quaint." Josephine's voice held a note of condescension that made Martha Pearson stiffen beside Eleanor. "Thomas and I will be married in Helena next month. The governor himself has promised to attend." "How wonderful for you," Eleanor replied sincerely, surprised to find she felt no envy whatsoever. "I wish you both every happiness." Josephine's perfectly arched eyebrows rose slightly, as though she had expected, perhaps even hoped for, a different reaction. "Yes, well, Thomas is hosting a dinner for several cattle buyers from Chicago this evening. I really must finish my errands." She made to step past them, then paused. "I must say, Miss Thompson, you've shown remarkable adaptability in your circumstances." The implied criticism hung in the air between them. "I've been fortunate beyond measure," Eleanor replied, her voice steady and warm. "What appeared at first to be misfortune turned out to be the greatest blessing of my life." Something flickered in Josephine's carefully composed expression. A moment of uncertainty, perhaps even envy, before her social mask slipped back into place. "Indeed, well, good day to you both." As she swept away toward the dressmaker's shop, Martha let out a low whistle. "That woman has more ice in her veins than the creek in January," Eleanor laughed. "She's simply playing the role she was raised for, and she'll be exactly the kind of wife Thomas Reynolds wants, decorative, socially ambitious, and completely under his control." "Unlike you," Martha observed shrewdly. "Unlike me?" Eleanor agreed with a smile. "Now, we'd better get these supplies back to the ranch before Mrs. Abernathy sends out a search party." The encounter with Josephine Caldwell faded from Eleanor's mind as the wedding day approached. The dress she had sewn with Mrs. Abernathy's assistance hung ready in her room, not the elaborate silk and lace creation Josephine would likely wear, but a simple gown of finest cream wool with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs that Eleanor had painstakingly stitched herself. The night before the wedding, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep, her mind too full of anticipation for the day ahead. Wrapping a shawl around her nightgown, she slipped out to the porch, seeking comfort in the vast canopy of stars overhead. She was surprised to find Mason already there, seated in the porch swing. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly, crossing to sit beside him. "How did you know it was me?" he asked with a smile, reaching automatically for her hand. "Your footsteps," Mason replied. "Lighter than Daniel's, more purposeful than Mrs. Abernathy's shuffling gait. I'd know your steps anywhere." The simple statement touched Eleanor deeply. "We shouldn't be seeing each other," she teased gently. "It's bad luck before the wedding." "Technically, I'm not seeing you at all," Mason pointed out with the dry humor she had come to cherish. "And I believe the superstition applies to the groom seeing the bride in her wedding dress, which, unless you've made some very interesting choices in nightwear, isn't currently a concern." Eleanor laughed, leaning against his solid warmth. "Fair point." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, the rustle of wind through the cottonwood leaves. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Mason finally asked. "A little," Eleanor admitted. "Not about marrying you," she hastened to add, feeling him tense slightly beside her. "Just about being the center of attention." Mason nodded in understanding. "I felt the same way after my accident. Everyone watching, wondering how the blind man would manage. It's an uncomfortable sensation." Exactly. Once again, Eleanor marveled at how perfectly Mason understood her, how he could translate her experiences through the lens of his own without diminishing either. "And they'll be watching," Mason acknowledged, "but only because they're happy for us. Even those who aren't, like Reynolds and his ice princess, will soon find more interesting subjects for their gossip." "Ice princess," Eleanor echoed with a laugh. "Martha called her something similar today. Did you see her in town?" "Yes, she made sure to mention that the governor will attend her wedding." Mason snorted softly. "Of course he will. Reynolds donated generously to his campaign last year. Politics and business all tied up with social climbing." He squeezed her hand. "Are you sure you wouldn't prefer that life? Last chance to run away with a wealthy cattle baron who can offer you silk dresses and dinner with governors." Though his tone was light, Eleanor heard the faint trace of genuine question beneath the teasing. "I would prefer a life of honest work, with a man of genuine character," she said firmly. "Besides, I've met Thomas Reynolds. The comparison does not favor him." Mason's laugh held both humor and relief. "I'm glad to hear it." He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Now, much as I'd like to sit here all night with you, Mrs. Abernathy would have my hide if she caught us. You need your rest. For tomorrow." "As do you," Eleanor agreed reluctantly. "I suppose this is our last night apart." "The very last," Mason promised, his voice deepening with meaning that sent a pleasant shiver through Eleanor. He walked her to the kitchen door, stealing one more kiss before sending her inside with a whispered, "Until tomorrow." Eleanor slept surprisingly well after that, waking refreshed as sunlight streamed through her small window. The wedding was scheduled for 2 o'clock, but the morning passed in a flurry of activity as final preparations were made for the celebration that would follow. By noon, Mrs. Abernathy declared everything in order and shooed Eleanor upstairs to prepare. "Martha will be here shortly to help with your hair," she announced. "I've laid out fresh water for washing, and don't forget the lavender sachet I put with your things." Eleanor impulsively hugged the older woman, an action that left Mrs. Abernathy momentarily speechless. "Thank you," Eleanor said fervently. "For everything." Mrs. Abernathy patted her back awkwardly before stepping away. "Yes, well, can't have the bride looking anything less than perfect." Her stern expression softened slightly. "Mason may not be able to see you, but everyone else will. And more importantly, you'll know you look your best on this day." With that remarkably perceptive comment, she bustled away, leaving Eleanor blinking back unexpected tears. Martha arrived soon after, bringing not only her skilled hands for hairstyling, but also a crown of late summer wildflowers she had gathered that morning. "Every bride needs something special," she explained, as she arranged Eleanor's hair in an elegant upswept style before securing the floral crown. "There, perfect." The simple word caught in Eleanor's throat as she gazed at her reflection in the small mirror. The woman who looked back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened, rejected woman who had stood alone on the train platform just 5 months earlier. This woman's eyes were clear and confident, her posture straight, her expression serene with the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The journey to the church was a blur in Eleanor's memory afterward. The wagon decorated with ribbons and flowers, Daniel Pearson driving with unusual care over the familiar roads, Martha beside her offering quiet reassurance. The small church was filled to capacity when they arrived. the entire community turning out to witness the union of the blind rancher and the mail-order bride who had found each other through such unlikely circumstances. Eleanor paused at the church door, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. Daniel, who would escort her down the aisle in place of her late father, sensed her hesitation. "He's waiting for you," he said simply. "Has been since the moment you arrived, though neither of you knew it then." The profound truth of this statement steadied Eleanor. She placed her hand on Daniel's arm and nodded. "I'm ready." The assembled guests rose as she entered, their faces blending into a sea of smiles as Eleanor's focus narrowed to the tall figure standing at the altar. Mason couldn't see her approach, but his face was turned toward the sound of her footsteps, his expression a mixture of joy and reverence that stole her breath. Pastor Miller, who had known Mason since childhood, conducted the ceremony with personal warmth and dignity. When the time came to exchange vows, Mason took Eleanor's hands in his touch as sure as if he could see every detail of her face. "Eleanor Thompson," he began, his deep voice carrying clearly through the church. "Before you came into my life, I had learned to navigate a world of darkness, but I had forgotten what it meant to truly live in the light. You restored that to me, not through pity or obligation, but through your strength, your intelligence, and your willingness to see beyond surface appearances to the heart of things." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the congregation as Mason continued, "I cannot promise you an easy life. The ranch demands much, the winters are harsh, and you've bound your future to a man with obvious limitations." A wry smile touched his lips. "But I can promise you this. I will cherish you every day of our lives together. I will respect your mind, your heart, and your spirit. I will be your partner in all things. And though I cannot see your face with my eyes, I will see you, truly see you, with everything else that I am." Tears spilled freely down Eleanor's cheeks now, but her voice was steady as she spoke her own vows. "Mason Walker, when I came to Montana, I thought I was seeking security and stability, a practical arrangement with a man I had never met. Instead, I found something infinitely more precious, a man whose courage, intelligence, and kindness revealed to me what true partnership could be." She squeezed his hands gently. "You say you have limitations, but in you I have found only strength and possibility. You have taught me that what matters most is not what we can or cannot do, but how we choose to face the world with the gifts we've been given. I promise to walk beside you through whatever challenges we face, to be your eyes when you need them, and to trust you to see the truth of me even when I cannot see it myself." When Pastor Miller pronounced them husband and wife, Mason cradled Eleanor's face between his hands with exquisite gentleness, his fingertips mapping her features before he lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that sealed their vows more profoundly than any words could have done. The celebration at the W Ranch continued well into the evening. Tables had been set up in the yard beneath strings of lanterns that glowed golden as the sun set behind the mountains. The ranch hands had constructed a dance floor where Mason surprised everyone, Eleanor most of all, by leading his bride in a perfectly executed waltz. "How did you manage that?" she asked breathlessly as they moved gracefully among the other dancers. "Mrs. Abernathy," Mason explained with a grin. "She's been drilling me for weeks, counting steps and measuring distances. Said she wouldn't have. A boy embarrassing his bride on their wedding day?" Eleanor laughed, joy bubbling up from some bottomless well within her. "That woman thinks of everything. Speaking of which," Mason said, his expression turning serious, "she informed me this morning that she's departing for Oregon the day after tomorrow. Says her sister needs her, though I suspect the timing is not coincidental. She's giving us privacy to begin our marriage," Eleanor agreed. She also mentioned she'd be gone at least 2 months, possibly through the winter, depending on weather conditions. Mason's voice held amusement. "I believe we're being given an extended honeymoon." ranch style. As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. Abernathy appeared at Mason's elbow. "Time to cut the cake," she announced. "Everyone's waiting." The wedding cake, a marvel of Mrs. Abernathy's baking skills, with 3 tiers of spice cake filled with apple preserves, drew appreciative murmurs from the guests. Mason and Eleanor cut it together, his hand covering hers on the knife with the easy coordination they had developed over months of working side by side. As the evening progressed, Eleanor circulated among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes with gracious warmth. She was speaking with Sarah from the cafe when she noticed Thomas Reynolds and Josephine Caldwell on the periphery of the celebration, their expressions a study in contrasts. Josephine's face a mask of polite interest, Reynolds betraying undisguised curiosity. Excusing herself from Sarah, Eleanor approached them with genuine welcome. "Mr. Reynolds, Miss Caldwell, how kind of you to attend. I hope you're enjoying yourselves." Reynolds' gaze traveled over the simple but abundant celebration, the lantern light, the country musicians playing lively tunes, the guests in their Sunday best rather than formal attire. "It's certainly rustic," he said, the word clearly a substitute for less flattering alternatives. "We wanted something authentic," Eleanor replied, untroubled by his implied criticism. "Something that reflected the community we're part of." "Indeed." Reynolds seemed at a loss for further comment, but Josephine spoke up unexpectedly. "The ceremony was quite moving," she said, her usual coolness tempered by what appeared to be genuine sentiment. "Mr. Walker's vows were particularly eloquent." "Thank you," Eleanor said, touched by this unexpected kindness. "That means a deal." An awkward silence fell before Reynolds cleared his throat. "Well, we should be going. Early start tomorrow. Business in Helena." "Of course. Thank you both for coming." Eleanor extended her hand to each of them in turn. Reynolds took it briefly, but Josephine held it a moment longer, her eyes meeting Eleanor's with an expression that might have been envy or something more complex. "I hope you'll be very happy, Mrs. Walker," she said quietly. "I wish the same for you, Miss Caldwell," Eleanor replied with perfect sincerity. As the couple departed, Mason appeared at Eleanor's side, his hand finding hers with unerring accuracy. "Reynolds and his fiancée?" he asked, having overheard their voices. "Yes, they've just left. Did he apologize for rejecting you at the station?" Eleanor laughed. "Hardly, though Miss Caldwell offered surprisingly genuine congratulations. Perhaps she's discovering that a life with Thomas Reynolds may not be all silk dresses and social advancement," Mason mused. "Perhaps." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, suddenly weary after the emotional day. "But that's their story to write. Ours is just beginning." Mason pressed a kiss to her temple. "And what a story it will be." The celebration continued around them, but for Eleanor, the world had narrowed to this moment. This man who had seen her true worth when everyone else had overlooked it. This ranch that had become home. This community that had gradually accepted her as one of their own. From the edge of the dance floor, Mrs. Abernathy watched them with a rare, unguarded smile. When she caught Eleanor's eye, she gave a small, satisfied nod, as if to say, "Well done." Later that night, after the guests had departed and the household had settled into silence, Eleanor stood in the master bedroom, now her bedroom as well, gazing out at the star-filled sky above the ranch. Mason moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and drawing her back against his chest. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his breath warm against her hair. "That I never imagined happiness could feel like this," she admitted. "Complete, peaceful, yet somehow also like an adventure just beginning." Mason turned her in his arms, his hands gently framing her face. "My beautiful, courageous wife," he murmured. "Do you know when I first began to fall in love with you?" "When?" she asked, curious. "The day we met, you were devastated by Reynolds's rejection, yet there was such dignity in how you held yourself, such strength beneath the hurt." His thumbs traced the contours of her cheekbones with exquisite tenderness. "Others saw only a scared woman left at the station. I felt the steel in your spirit." "And I thought you were just being kind," Eleanor marveled. Mason smiled. "Kindness played a part, but even then, I sensed something special in you, something that matched what I needed, though I didn't yet know it." As he lowered his lips to hers, Eleanor closed her eyes, surrendering to the sensation of being truly seen, truly known, truly loved, not despite her perceived flaws or because of her useful qualities, but for the essence of who she was. Outside, the Montana night wrapped the Double W Ranch in star-dusted darkness. Inside, a light burned, a beacon of the home and life that Eleanor and Mason would build together, founded not on the superficial judgments of others, but on the profound recognition of each other's true beauty. 5 years had transformed the Double W Ranch in ways both subtle and profound. New fencing extended across the northern pastures, enclosing land Mason had purchased from a neighboring rancher who'd decided to retire to California. The barn had been expanded to accommodate the growing herd, the product of Mason's successful breeding program. The ranch house itself had gained a new wing, 2 additional bedrooms, and a small library filled with books that Eleanor read aloud on winter evenings. But the most significant changes weren't in the buildings or the boundaries. They were the people who called the Double W home. On a crisp October morning, Eleanor Walker stood on the front porch, watching her husband and their 3-year-old son, James, make their way across the yard. James toddled alongside his father, one tiny hand firmly clasped in Mason's larger one, the other pointing excitedly at a hawk circling overhead. "Papa! Bird!" the boy exclaimed, his clear voice carrying to where Eleanor stood. "What kind of bird?" "James?" Mason asked, tilting his face toward the sky, though he couldn't see the hawk himself. James screwed up his face in concentration, recalling the lessons Eleanor had been teaching him. "A hawk!" "Very good," Mason praised, ruffling the boy's dark hair, so like his own. "And what sound does a hawk make?" James let out a surprisingly accurate screech that made Eleanor laugh. Both males turned at the sound, identical smiles spreading across their faces. "Mama!" James broke away from his father and raced toward the porch, little legs pumping furiously. "I saw a hawk," I heard, Eleanor replied, bending to scoop him up despite the awkwardness of her heavily pregnant state. "You're becoming quite the naturalist." Mason reached the porch steps, moving with the same confidence he always showed on familiar terrain. "Should you be lifting him in your condition?" he asked, though his tone was more teasing than concerned. He'd learned during Eleanor's first pregnancy that suggesting limitations would earn him a lecture on the natural capabilities of the female body. "He's not that heavy," Eleanor replied, settling James on her hip, "and the baby isn't due for another 3 weeks. Mason's expression was skeptical as he climbed the steps and placed a gentle hand on her rounded belly. "Junior seems eager to join the family. I wouldn't be surprised if—" He broke off as a ripple moved across Eleanor's abdomen, visible even beneath her loose dress. His face lit with wonder, as it did every time he felt their child move. "Active this morning. She's been practicing. Her kick since dawn," Eleanor said, deliberately emphasizing the pronoun. Mason's smile widened. "Still convinced it's a girl?" "Absolutely certain. A daughter with her father's stubborn nature and her mother's common sense." "Poor child," Mason laughed, "doomed to a life of arguing with herself." James, bored with talk of the baby, squirmed to be put down. "Want to see the new calves, Mama?" "After breakfast," Eleanor promised, lowering him carefully to the porch floor. "Go wash your hands now. Martha made fresh biscuits." The mention of his favorite treat sent the boy scampering into the house, screen door slamming behind him despite repeated reminders to close it gently. Boundless energy, Mason observed fondly. Daniel says he's never seen a child so fearless on horseback. Must get that from you. Eleanor leaned into her husband's embrace, savoring the solid warmth of him. I was hardly fearless when we met. You were scared, not fearless, Mason corrected, pressing a kiss to her temple. There's a difference. Being scared and doing what needs doing anyway. That's the true meaning of courage. Our son comes by it honestly. Inside, the clatter of dishes announced Martha Pearson's preparations for breakfast. After Mrs. Abernathy's departure for Oregon 5 years earlier, what was meant to be a 2-month visit had stretched into permanent relocation when she'd met a widowed shopkeeper who wasn't completely useless. Martha had stepped in to help, manage the household, especially during Eleanor's first pregnancy. The arrangement had evolved naturally. Martha, who'd discovered she couldn't have children of her own, found joy in helping raise James and managing the expanding domestic operations of the ranch. Eleanor, freed from some of the daily household duties, had gradually taken on greater responsibility for the business aspects of the WW, discovering a talent for negotiation and financial planning that complemented Mason's breeding expertise and land management skills. "Letter came yesterday," Martha announced as they entered the kitchen, where James was already perched at the table, face freshly scrubbed. "From Mrs. Abernathy." Eleanor accepted the envelope eagerly. Though the former housekeeper wrote regularly, each letter was a treasured connection to the woman who had played such a pivotal role in bringing her and Mason together. "She's coming for a visit," Eleanor announced after scanning the contents. "In the spring, after the baby is born, travel is easier. Says her husband has business in Helena and they'll make the side trip to Willow Creek." "Wonderful," Mason said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Though I pity this Mr. Henderson if he thinks he's actually in charge of their travel plans." "She says he's coming along nicely," Eleanor quoted with a laugh. "Apparently, he's learned to distinguish good eggs from mediocre ones at the market and can be trusted to negotiate fair prices for flour." "High praise indeed," Mason chuckled. "I look forward to meeting the man brave enough to marry Harriet Abernathy." Breakfast passed with comfortable familiarity, James chattering about the hawk, farmhands coming and going with reports and questions, Martha efficiently managing the flow of food and information. When the meal concluded, Eleanor retired to the study to answer correspondence, while Mason took James to see the new calves, as promised. Seated at the desk that now held both her and Mason's business papers, Eleanor opened another envelope that had arrived with yesterday's mail. Unlike Mrs. Abernathy's personal letter, this one was addressed formally to Mr. and Mrs. Mason Walker. The heavy cream stationery bearing the embossed letterhead of the governor's mansion in Helena. The contents were unexpected. Governor Harrison and his wife requested the pleasure of their company at a symposium on agricultural innovation to be held in the capital the following month. Mason was specifically invited to speak about his successful cattle breeding program, which had garnered attention throughout the territory. Eleanor sat back, tapping the invitation thoughtfully against the desk. The timing was problematic with the baby due so soon, yet the opportunity was significant for the ranch and for Mason. Personally, recognition of his accomplishments despite his blindness would further the cause he had quietly championed for years, the integration of disabled individuals into all aspects of society. The sound of boots on the porch announced Mason's return. He entered the study with James perched on his shoulders, the boy's face alight with excitement. "The brown calf licked my hand, Mama," James announced. "His tongue is rough like sandpaper." "Fascinating," Eleanor replied with genuine interest. "Did you remember to thank Daniel for showing you?" "Yes." James nodded vigorously, then tugged at his father's hair. "Down, please, Papa. I want to draw the calf for Grandma Abernathy's letter." Mason obligingly lifted the boy from his shoulders and set him on his feet. "Art supplies are in the kitchen cupboard. Ask Martha to help you." As James scampered off, Mason turned his face toward Eleanor, his expression questioning. "You've gone. Quiet. Something in the mail." "An invitation," Eleanor explained, handing him the heavy paper even though he couldn't read it. The gesture had become habitual over the years, including him physically in all aspects of their shared life. "The governor wants you to speak at an agricultural symposium next month in Helena." Mason's eyebrows rose as he ran his fingers over the embossed letterhead. "The governor? Apparently your breeding program has attracted attention in high places." Eleanor outlined the details as Mason took a seat opposite her. "It's a significant honor." "But poor timing," Mason observed. "The baby will be barely a month old, if that. I won't leave you alone so soon after the birth." Eleanor smiled at his immediate prioritization of family over recognition. "I've been thinking about that. What if we all went together? James would love the train journey, and Martha could come to help with the children." Mason's expression turned thoughtful. "A family trip to the capital. It's not a small undertaking with a newborn." "No, but it might be worth it." Eleanor moved around the desk to perch carefully on the arm of his chair. "Your work deserves recognition, Mason, and frankly, the capital's residents deserve to see what's possible when talent is valued over perceived limitations." Mason caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Always my champion." "As you are." "Mine," she replied softly. The tender moment was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Martha's footsteps crossed the entry hall, followed by the murmur of voices, one of them familiar. "Dr. Hargrove to see you, ma'am," Martha announced from the doorway, her tone carefully neutral. Eleanor and Mason exchanged surprised glances. While the doctor still served the Willow Creek community, his interactions with the Walkers had been strictly professional and infrequent since his rejected advance years earlier. "Please show him in," Eleanor replied, moving to stand beside Mason's chair in unconscious unity. Dr. Hargrove entered the study, hat in hand. The years had added silver threads to his sandy hair, but his bearing remained confident, his expression composed. "Mr. and Mrs. Walker, thank you for seeing me without an appointment." "Of course," Mason replied evenly. "What brings you to the Double W?" The doctor hesitated, seemingly uncertain how to begin. "I've received an offer to establish a practice in San Francisco," he finally said. "A position at a new hospital there." "Congratulations," Eleanor said, genuinely pleased for him despite their complicated history. "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity." "Thank you." Dr. Hargrove shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Before I accept, I wanted to clear the air between us. My behavior toward you both, particularly 5 years ago, was presumptuous and inappropriate." The frank admission hung in the room, unexpected and oddly touching in its humility. Mason inclined his head slightly. "We appreciate your candor, Doctor. My motivations were mixed," Hargrove continued, addressing Eleanor directly now. "I was genuinely attracted to you, Mrs. Walker, but I also underestimated both your judgment and your husband's capabilities. It was arrogant and, well, I've come to regret it over the years." Eleanor studied the man before her, recognizing the cost of this confession to his pride. "Thank you for saying so, Doctor. We hold no ill will toward you." Relief crossed his features. "I'm grateful for that. Willow Creek has been good to me, despite my missteps. I wanted to leave with a clear conscience." "I'm sure you'll be missed," Mason said with surprising warmth. "You've served the community well, whatever your initial impressions of some of its members." Dr. Hargrove accepted the olive branch with a nod. "I've learned a great deal here professionally and personally." His gaze took in the evidence of their shared life, the dual desk arrangement, the child's drawing pinned to the wall, the obvious harmony between husband and wife. "You've built something remarkable together." "We have," Eleanor agreed, placing a hand on Mason's shoulder. After Dr. Hargrove departed, declining their invitation to stay for coffee, Eleanor found herself oddly moved by the encounter. "That was unexpected," she observed. "People can surprise you," Mason replied, reaching up to cover her hand with his own. "Sometimes it takes years to recognize our own blindness." The irony of this statement from her sightless husband made Eleanor laugh. Indeed, though some see more clearly from the beginning. The weeks that followed passed in a whirlwind of preparation for the baby's arrival, for the potential trip to Helena, for the coming winter. Eleanor wrote to the governor's office accepting the invitation contingent on her health after delivery, and to Mrs. Abernathy confirming their eagerness for her spring visit. The baby, as Mason had predicted, arrived early, a daughter born on a snowy November night, with Daniel riding through a blizzard to fetch the new young doctor who had taken over Dr. Hargrove's practice. Eleanor endured the labor with the same quiet strength she applied to all challenges, and Mason paced the hallway with James, answering the boy's worried questions with patient honesty. "My daughter," Mason whispered when the doctor finally invited him into the bedroom where Eleanor lay exhausted but triumphant with the newborn in her arms. "My beautiful girl." "Sarah Grace Walker," Eleanor said softly, as Mason's gentle hands explored the infant's tiny features. The button nose, rosebud, mouth, wisps of dark hair. "After your mother and mine." Mason's throat worked as he struggled for composure. "Perfect," he managed finally, gathering his wife and daughter close. James, allowed in to meet his sister, approached the bed with unusual caution. "She's very small," he observed critically. "She'll grow," Eleanor assured him, making space for her son to climb up beside her. "Just as you did." "Can she see?" James asked, peering into his sister's unfocused blue eyes. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "Though babies don't see clearly at first, everything is blurry to her right now." James considered this solemnly. "Like Papa?" "No," Mason answered, his voice gentle but firm. "Papa's eyes don't work at all, but Sarah's will grow stronger every day until she can see as clearly as you and Mama do." The boy nodded, accepting this explanation. "I'll help her see things until then," he decided, "like Mama helps you." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Mason, their shared pride in their son's compassionate nature requiring no words. The trip to Helena was postponed until spring, when it could be combined with Mrs. Abernathy's visit, a decision made easier by the governor's gracious understanding and promise to reschedule the symposium. The winter passed in the cocoon of family life, the Double W Ranch snug beneath blankets of snow, as Sarah grew and thrived. On a February evening, with wind howling around the eaves and snow falling steadily outside, the Walker family gathered. In the library, James played with wooden blocks on the rug, constructing an elaborate fort for his toy soldiers. Sarah slept peacefully in the cradle Mason had carved during Eleanor's pregnancy, her tiny face serene in the firelight. And Eleanor sat beside her husband on the sofa, reading aloud from a new novel that had arrived in the most recent package from the Denver bookstore. "The end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time," she read. T.S. Eliot's words resonated in the warm room. Mason's hand found hers, fingers intertwining with familiar comfort. "That's rather fitting, isn't it?" "How so?" Eleanor asked, marking her place in the book. "Your journey began with rejection at that train station. A door closed before you could even knock." Mason's expression was contemplative. "Yet it led you here, to a life I suspect is quite different from what you imagined when you answered." Thomas Reynolds' advertisement. "Completely different," Eleanor agreed, "and infinitely better." Mason smiled, the expression transforming his serious face as it always did. "Do you ever wonder what Reynolds thinks, seeing the life we've built?" Together? The success of the ranch, our family, your role in the community. Honestly, I hardly think of him at all anymore, Eleanor replied truthfully. Though I did hear from Sarah at the cafe that his marriage to Josephine isn't particularly happy. Apparently, she spends most of her time in Helena while he remains at the ranch. Unsurprising, Mason observed. A marriage built on social advancement rather than genuine affection has a poor foundation. Eleanor leaned against her husband's shoulder, watching their son play and their daughter sleep. We were fortunate, weren't we, finding each other through such unlikely circumstances. I prefer to think of it as fate, Mason replied, wrapping an arm around her, or perhaps simply the universe recognizing what we each needed before we knew it ourselves. A blind rancher and a scared mail-order bride, Eleanor mused. Not the most promising beginning. On the contrary, Mason pressed a kiss to her temple. The most promising beginning imaginable. Two people seeing beyond appearances to the truth beneath. Everything worthwhile in life grows from that kind. A vision. Outside, the Montana winter wrapped the Double W Ranch in its frozen embrace. Inside, surrounded by the family they had created together, Eleanor Walker closed her eyes and saw clearly the beautiful journey from rejection to belonging, from fear to courage, from loneliness to love. "Read another chapter?" Mason asked, content. In their shared warmth. "Gladly," Eleanor replied, opening the book once more. Her voice rose and fell in the firelit room, painting pictures with words for the man who had taught her the deepest meaning of vision. The ability to see with the heart what remained invisible to the eye. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.